She's been called the biggest pop star of the century. She has the highest net worth of any female singer. Her fans span across generations, and her tours and her albums sell out, well, swiftly.
Welcome to the Eras Tour.
Taylor Swift is in her history-making era. The pop icon officially has the highest grossing music tour ever.
We can talk about a figure like Taylor Swift as being a cultural architect in that she's setting up and kind of articulating some norms around things like, say, white girlhood or femininity in the 21st century.
That's Paula Harper, assistant professor of music at the University of Chicago. She researches music, sound, and the internet, and also co-edited the first academic book about Taylor Swift.
I generally say, no, don't call me a Swiftie, call me a Taylor Swift scholar, perhaps, a Swift scholar. And in part, I think that that's because as somebody who's researching, especially the Taylor Swift fandom, I'm really, really aware of the particularities of being a Swiftie, and of the encyclopedic knowledge that the kinds of work that Swifties are doing, which is different and distinct from the kinds of work that I am doing as an academic.
Harper is interested in how music circulates on digital platforms and how gender, fandom, sound, and media intersect. And she says artists like Swift, as well as Beyoncé, whose fame grew along with their social media followings, have been compelling case studies for studying popular music today.
These stars are virtuosic in working to navigate digital media really, really savvily, right? Being really, really cognizant of how audiovisuality works online, right? So I'm thinking about the Beyoncé visual album as something that was really, really a kind of declaration of virtuosic understanding of how audiovisual media circulates online. Or, on the other hand, somebody like Taylor Swift, who has been engaged with social media since the very, very beginnings of her career, right?
Harper is also working on a book about virality, what makes a song or a sound go viral, and how artists are leveraging social media platforms like TikTok or Instagram to become an overnight success.
I'm really interested in artists who are performing on platforms like TikTok or platforms like Instagram. They're not just using that as a space for promotion. They're not expecting their listeners to move off of that platform, maybe go to Spotify or catch them in concert or something, but that they're really thinking about crafting music for performance on these short form video sites or platforms.
And in today's music ecosystem, there's even more competition for artists to go viral on social media, especially as AI-generated music is now filling our feeds. Which begs the question, could the next big pop star or the next viral hit be AI-generated?
I think as we're recording this right now, a big news story in my ecosystem is that number one at the top of the country digital downloads chart is a song that is at least in part AI generated. It's a song called Walk My Walk by the AI generated band Breaking Rust. By not being coy about this, by saying well, yeah, you know what, we do have a platform full of AI music. I think that it's only encouraging people to further devalue streaming music.
From the University of Chicago Podcast Network, welcome to Big Brains, the show where we explore the groundbreaking research and discoveries that are transforming our world. I'm your host, Paul Rand. Join me as we meet the minds behind the breakthroughs. On today's episode, the science of viral music and the forces driving today's fandom. I wonder if I can take us all back kind of to the beginning to really understand the significance of what it is that you're studying, and that is sound, and why sound has always been such a powerful cultural force.
You've given me an absolutely enormous question here, but I'm going to answer it from the vantage of my research. So I am currently finishing up a book about virality, things going viral online. And one of the starting points for me is exactly a version of this question that you've just asked, is thinking about what kinds of affordances and capacities music is carrying with it, music bears, that it brings to the digital age. And so, music is something that has a lot of baggage or connotations, generally speaking, pretty positive, right? We think about, oftentimes, we talk sometimes in my world about musical exceptionalism, that when people invoke music, they're generally doing it in a positive way. Positive connotations about bringing people together, about uniting them, right? Metaphors of kind of harmony, unison. And we think about the kinds of collectivity that music can engender, people coming together to make music, to put their voices or instruments together in ways that are pleasurable, that feel good, that sound good, right? The pleasure of music in your body. But that also music has capacities that can be a little bit trickier or more ambivalent than that, right? So sound is something that can exceed boundaries.
When we talk about it being a cultural force, how do you explain that and why that is actually so important?
Just the experience of going to a live concert, something that my students frequently talk about as under the Durkheimian frame of collective effervescence, really putting their core to use there. But thinking about the way that, you go to a Taylor Swift concert, say, you go to a massive stadium filled with other people who are all engaging in the same physical activity as you.
You got a shared experience
right?
together.
Yeah,
right.
Shared experience, right? You might be singing along, you're all syncing up your breath and your heartbeat, you're doing the same thing with your bodies. There's a real thrill in that.
Is there some monumental moment when you look at it and say, whether it was, maybe if there was, perhaps it was certainly the internet, but was there something digital or something beforehand that really began the era that we're currently in?
I do think the internet, the kind of 90s, but especially kind of early 2000s internet, the peer-to-peer file sharing, Napster era, the technicities of the internet is a real, a really important shift in maybe in the kind of formal properties of music, but I think it's certainly a huge shift in terms of the economic functioning of music industries, and then the way that kind of is in dialogue with social formations around music and its circulation, as well as kind of ideas about music and musical value, kind of musical commodities, and how we value those, and how that in turn relates to things like compensation for a variety of folks who are involved in it, right? So I think there's a massive shift that is, that is technological, that is economic, that happens in the early internet era with the kind of peer-to-peer file sharing affordances that get built out there, that has a massive amount to do with the kind of current situation that we are in. If we think about, streaming, the domination of something like Spotify and Apple Music, even I think some of the roots of AI music and the AI music ecosystem that is on the rise right now, that I think there's a way in which we can trace a huge amount of that to the changes that are ushered in the peer-to-peer file sharing in the Napster era. And so there are a lot of people who are doing really great work right now on, say, Spotify, right? On music platforms, on spaces that are explicitly music, or on genres like, say, hyperpop, things that feel really A, explicitly musical, and B, specific to the digital ecosystem in which we find ourselves. And I am more fascinated by things that are a little bit more eccentrically defined as music, things that people might say, is that really music? Are we really talking about music here? So I'm more interested in kind of edge cases or fringe cases. So obviously Spotify, I think most people would agree that that's a music platform, but is TikTok a music platform? Is Twitter a music platform? I once had a student ask, is LinkedIn a music platform? I haven't considered that one yet. But
I've
maybe,
never heard
right?
that, but okay, yes.
I haven't dug into it enough to think about it, right? But so with this expanded concept of thinking about music not as a noun, but as a verb, as something that involves collections of people doing stuff, I think that really helps me think about a lot of the things that are happening online, specifically these explosions of virality, right? Which I see as people really engaged in something.
So you talked a little bit earlier about, how sound and music was shaping and guiding culture, but now there's a whole new game in town, and I wonder if you can talk about what's at stake when algorithms and platforms are really arguably helping decide which sounds and which ideas and which music gets amplified. What are we gaining from that? And maybe even as importantly, what are we losing?
There have always been folks who are making decisions that impact what kinds of music certain audiences have access to, what kinds of music is getting a lot of airplay and what kinds of music isn't, right? Thinking about, genre divisions around race lines in the early periods of the American music industry, right? So there have always been sets of people making decisions and institutions making decisions about what is available to be listened to under a kind of, mass media music industry regime. Here, as you point out, right, that we are in a space that feels different, distinct, more intensified. And I think part of that is absolutely true. I think part of it is also a feeling that when, say, like the world of, this kind of like Napster and beyond world of digital music, that was oftentimes framed across the 2000s and 2010s as this real kind of liberatory, democratizing turn of events, that this was something that was knocking down, that was, eroding these gatekeeping structures, that this wasn't going to be the case anymore, right? We were entering a new era where we weren't going to have those kinds of forces making those decisions for audiences. And now we are in a space where in some ways it feels like those decisions are more overdetermined than ever, in ways where, maybe when we're thinking about the kind of like mid-century or like late 20th century music industry ecosystem, right, with like radio play and payola, we're thinking about the music industry, various music industry players instantiating a kind of monoculture, right? Everyone is listening to X because that's who's getting played on the radio and that's what we have access to, right? Whereas now we're in kind of the reverse situation. There are still some artists who are gaining huge amounts, maybe outsized amounts of attention, one of whom is somebody that I have written about, Taylor Swift.
Yep, we'll talk about that.
Which we'll talk about. But we also have this situation in which it feels like that those decisions that are being made not by the listeners themselves but by corporate interests feel like they are, rather than collectivizing, that they're isolating, right? That I'm listening to this this playlist that Spotify has curated for me that is nothing like the playlist that somebody very close to me is listening to, and I think that could be exciting and like liberatory, but I think that there are a number of reasons why people understand it to be anxiety inducing, have a variety of kind of negative reactions to that being the situation, to Spotify and its algorithms being in control of curation in a very different way than curation was happening in, say, the 60s or the 80s or the 90s even.
So maybe if you said, here's the biggest thing I'm concerned about this quote unquote curation happening through, the platforms and algorithms and so forth, what things about that are the most troubling to you?
I mean, I think that one of the things that I'm deeply concerned about is just musicians getting paid.
Okay.
That the Spotify model, the streaming model is not viable for musicians, right? Musicians effectively cannot make a living through the circulation of their music on these platforms, and there's not really a route for them to make the musical commodity that existed in, say, the LP or the tape cassette or the CD, that doesn't exist anymore, nor is there a norm around purchase of musical commodities that provides payment to artists. But I do think that, to me, one of the just the biggest issues is that this is not an ecosystem where artists can make a living off of their music, and that is, to me, a fundamental problem, and leads to an ecosystem where it just makes it more possible for, say, Spotify to fill their musical archives with, say, AI generated music, because if musicians aren't able, if human musicians aren't able to make a living off of this, they are less likely to be doing so. And so, the possibility of a kind of future landscape filled with just AI generated music that you're meant to have on in the background.
It makes all the sense in the world. Let me change gears on you a little bit. I'm going to go back into our current times, and maybe, for lack of a better word, pop star times. And it wasn't that long ago when somebody, and it may have been you or there's others, that started deciding that Taylor Swift was worthy of studying from an academic point of view. And so you talk about Taylor Swift and arguably Beyoncé as being more than pop stars. And you talk about them being, if this is the right word, cultural architects. And tell me what you mean by that they are cultural architects.
I would say that, yes, I was in a bit of the vanguard of academics studying Taylor Swift, academics taking Taylor Swift seriously, but that is the kind of media framing, the kind of like discursive kerfuffles that you suggest or that you point to there, right? That this is the same kind of thing that people were doing when people started talking about Beyoncé.
Right. But,
you can find people saying this about classes about the Beatles or classes about Madonna, right? So on the one hand, it's like, I was one of in a group of the first folks who were who were saying, like, hey, why aren't we talking about Taylor Swift in the way that we've already been talking about Beyonce or these other figures? And I think that those figures then can become avatars for a whole host of other things that are not explicitly musical and that maybe are pretty far away from music, right? So, I think maybe closer in, we can talk about a figure like Taylor Swift as being a cultural architect in that she's setting up and kind of articulating some norms around things like, say, white girlhood or femininity in the 21st century, or, how to perform a certain kind of political affiliation, or how to perform a certain kind of being in the world as as somebody engaging in romance and in the contemporary discourse where you're getting yelled at on the internet, maybe, right? So Taylor Swift or a figure like that as this avatar for how to be in the world, and that being expressed again, you drafting on these positive affective qualities of music, right? That I'm listening to this and I'm like bopping along with this, but also the celebrity who is giving this to me is providing me a template for an aspirational template for how to exist in the world.
That's a great way to put it. So it's hard to think about both of those artists, Taylor Swift and Beyonce and some others, without thinking about the sheer brilliance of how they use fandom and virality to build cultural power. And the internet has empowered them to do that to a really significant degree. You're nodding, so tell me why you agree with that, and expand on that thought, if you would, please.
Yeah, I think it's not a coincidence that both of these artists are artists who started off very young, who were incredibly professional and professional minded, very young, and whose careers have spanned this kind of like pre to post digital musical world, right? Or at least like they're both figures who were around before the advent of the internet, at least the internet, the kind of social Web 2.0 internet as we know it. So these are folks who were starting out in and amongst people familiar with the pre-Napster music industry, and who kind of got on as early adopters of things like social media and like how to perform on social media. Taylor Swift has navigated that, but I would say that among their various virtuosities, these stars are virtuosic in working to navigate digital media really, really savvily, right? Being really, really cognizant of how audiovisuality works online, right? So I'm thinking about the Beyoncé visual album as something that was really, really a kind of declaration of virtuosic understanding of how audiovisual media circulates online. The fact that a visual album would be well received in the mid 2010s platform ecosystem. The fact that, you know, every song needed to have a video with it at that moment, and that the videos were going to be like parsed and remixed, right? Or, you know, on the other hand, somebody like Taylor Swift, who has been engaged with social media since the very, very beginnings of her career, right? Not just, you know, she was notoriously present on the Tumblr platform, but even before that, she was a presence on the MySpace platform. So this is somebody who, you know, who is not here in the 2020s thinking like, oh, I need to like get on TikTok to be relatable. This is somebody who has kind of set the tone for what we think of when we think of celebrities and musical celebrities being relatable. And again, right, we're thinking about these platforms that are not explicitly musical platforms, but where musical discourse, musical fandom has been happening since way back at the beginnings of the social media platform ecosystem.
You know, it's and I'm not sure how this relates to it, but any folks that are listening that have, you know, young kids, young daughters, or nieces, nephews, or others, the phenomena of the Eras Tour and the bracelets and the whole experience of going, that on its own really was a pretty profound cultural experience. Why did that work in the moment that it was in?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely perfect storm, that, like I was saying before when I was talking about stadium concerts and collective effervescence, and also a kind of post-pandemic anxious, ambivalent return to stadium concerts, to live music performance, that this is something where the Eras Tour, similar to Beyonce's Renaissance Tour, right, those two were happening at the same time, was this massive, again, right, kind of like avatar for returning to in-person concerts post-pandemic lockdowns, that this is something that a lot of people were really thirsty for and excited about and willing to spend huge amounts of time and energy doing. But then beyond those who couldn't spend the huge amounts of especially money on these, you know, on these tickets, on traveling to these concerts, that we have also this apparatus, which again has been kind of made robust by even the pandemic, right? This apparatus of live streaming, a kind of set of expectations about how live streaming works, about how this kind of amplified hybrid, we're doing this collectively, but we're doing it digitally as well, right? How lots and lots of people got much more comfortable with and savvy about kind of those hybrid technologies. That the Eras Tour is launching in the wake of that too. So you not just have people who are going to the tours, but you have people who are every night live streaming them, who are watching TikTok live streams, who are watching live streams on Twitch or other streaming platforms. So you get this collectivity that it is maybe fomented by the loss of, or the absence of it in the pandemic, but also is enabled by the technologies that people have built or learned to use more virtuosically to make that collectivity happen again during the pandemic.
The other thing that really caused a great amount of attention, and I never would believe that I would know who Scooter Braun was, but Scooter Braun became a bit of a villain in a story of ownership and control. And Taylor Swift was a driver in making that all work, and that ties back into that point you were making about people taking charge of their music. Tell me about that experience and why, if you think that was significant in shaping how music and culture are continuing to evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely think that is a significant part of the Taylor Swift story. I think that story is indicative of particular virtuosities of Taylor Swift, right? To be able to communicate to a fan base who presumably does not know that much about the intricacies of, say, U.S. musical copyright law, to be able to get them into a space where they're familiar with some of the ins and outs of that. Now, this is a very, very useful case study.
Yep.
And I think that that Taylor Swift is, this conflict with Scooter Braun, the question of buying back her own masters, or of not having control of her masters. This is something that has a longer history in pop music that I think, a number of, kind of like rock heads might be really familiar with. People like Prince, for example, having massive disputes over masters. So it connects her with this legacy of artists who are having similar kinds of struggles over authorial control. And then it's also connected, I think, discursively connected in people's minds to, say, the Me Too movement of the time, right? There's a kind of gendered labor component and a gender dynamic to it, right? And so it made for a really compelling narrative for her to buy back her masters, right? As a kind of success that many fans, felt as though they were participants in.
Yeah, I think you're right.
They're again, to put it in kind of economic terms, but terms that I've seen people use, right? That they are stakeholders in Taylor Swift Inc. And that their purchases, their fan purchases, their purchases of multiple variants of her album or tickets to her concerts or her merch, that these contribute to this project of returning her masters to her, of allowing her to purchase them back, right? So the way that she
so as I listen to you on this, you sound like a Taylor Swift fan. Would you consider yourself, what's the word, a Swiftie?
I feel like I have to answer this all the time.
I'm sure you do.
I generally say, like, no, don't call me a Swiftie. Call me a Taylor Swift scholar, perhaps a Swift scholar. And in part, I think that that's because as somebody who's researching, especially the Taylor Swift fandom, I'm really, really aware of the particularities of being a Swiftie, and of the encyclopedic knowledge that the kinds of work that Swifties are doing, which is different and distinct from the kinds of work that I am doing as an academic.
I want to go back to this point, and I hadn't really spent much time thinking about it, but this idea where AI is generating music and how it's shaping, and I think we've gotten to this point where platforms, of course, are not just distributing sound; they clearly are shaping what we hear. Mm-hmm. They're shaping what we believe, and I wonder if you can talk about how this feedback loop loop is influencing culture and arguably even politics.
Yeah, I think so. I think as we're recording this right now, a big news story in my ecosystem is that number one at the top of the country digital downloads chart is a song that is at least in part AI generated. It's a song called "Walk My Walk" by the AI generated band Breaking Rust.
So can you explain it? It's not a real band.
It is, yeah. So it is a band, in the sense that in a kind of Spotify metadata sense, in that it is an artist in Spotify's terms that you can click on and that has songs. But these songs are again, at least in part, but perhaps entirely AI generated. And, I think that there are also possibilities, this kind of specter of, what if we get, massive AI generated artists, right? What if they're taking over the top of the charts like this? And, again, this kind of like specter of robots taking our jobs in a kind of spectacular way, right? What if pop stars get replaced by robots? But I think that the more mundane reality is that it's not necessarily pop stars, right? I think that there's still probably going to be a kind of winner-take-all, like massive pop stars as real humans reality. But that it's the more the songs that are less spectacularly, explosive on the Spotify platform, and that, it's songs that are filling out playlists. And I think that encouraging by not being coy about this, by saying like, well, yeah, you know what, we do have a platform full of AI music. I think that it's only encouraging people to further devalue streaming.
As we look toward the future, and I think your discussion about AI generated music is certainly something that I have every confidence we're going to be seeing more of. Are there other big shifts in online sound and music that we should be expecting, seeing, even being concerned about or excited about?
I think something that has already become a shift, or a shift that we have already undertaken, is a shift towards music that is designed and kind of native to a short form video ecosystem. So people have already talked about, kind of music is shorter these days, which I think is, quantitatively true, that the average length of pop songs or songs in the Billboard chart is shorter now than it was at times past. But I also think that I'm really interested in artists who are performing on platforms like TikTok or platforms like Instagram. They're not just using that as a space for promotion. They're not expecting their listeners to move off of that platform, maybe go to Spotify or catch them in concert or something, but that they're really thinking about crafting music for performance on these short form video sites or platforms. And I think that there's something really interesting about that, that those songs oftentimes are not just shorter, but they're different in terms of their form. Mm-hmm. I think that they're different in terms of content. So that there's a kind of like a whole little ecosystem of musical genres that are happening outside of kind of the standard music industry genre space, and even the like Spotify genre space that these short form video platforms have made it possible for really, like new kinds of music to emerge in a way that I find really fascinating.